Hi guys, good to be here. So today just didn't really want to pitch anything here. I just wanted to share some data that we've been seeing lately around how users and on-chain behavior on bridges has been occurring of late. Especially in recent times, it's been very interesting in light of recent events to see some of the flows on-chain across multiple layer 1s and layer 2 blockchains and see some of the trends in terms of how users are actually using cross-chain bridges. So, the title of this presentation is to take a view over the bridge, but the reality of the situation is it's pretty hard to do that because today's ecosystem is pretty diverse and very broad. We have a lot of different bridges. There's a lot of different chains as well. There's over 100 different active blockchains now, and over 5 different bridges that have over several $1 billion locked. Some of the biggest ones obviously here are between the major blockchains, ETH, BSC, Polygon, Avalanche, etc., as you can see here. But the reality of the situation is, even in the past month, even with the decline in, dramatic decline in crypto asset prices, we've seen over $4 billion of value flow through some of the major bridges, which is a pretty significant number, and it really proves that these kind of highways are what run our industry and underpin the underlying blockchains that are the foundation of this space. And when we look at bridges, it's kind of a huge space that's really broadened out over the past year and a half. And there are many different ways of segmenting them. But one of the biggest things that we look for is really security. Because just for context here, for people who aren't really too familiar with what bridges do, the function of a bridge is to move liquidity primarily across different blockchains. And when they do so, usually they lock some sort of funds on one side of the bridge and then release other funds on the other side of the bridge. And some of these bridges are single asset bridges, like Wrap Bitcoin is a big example. The Polygon POS bridge, another big example, just for one chain. And then there are multi-asset, multi-chain bridges that have multiple chains and multiple assets as well. But one of the biggest things that we look for here is, in the trusted column here, are we actually trusting some third party or middleman out when you're depositing funds in a bridge? It's a big trust assumption that we have to really evaluate when we're using a bridge, because effectively you're locking funds in a bridge to actually use it. And when you lock funds, you're effectively trusting both sides to work properly in order for the bridge to be reliable, right? And this kind of trust assumption, not a lot of people question when using bridges because it's kind of implicit with a lot of these bridges. Even though they're on-chain, you're still trusting that both assets on both sides of the bridge are secure. And there's a lot of auditing involved in actually making sure that this is the case. And the reality of this is proven here, really, when we look at even 2022, some of the top exploits of the year have been bridge related, right? Over $1.2 billion just this year alone has been stolen as a result of bridge related exploits, which is a pretty staggering number. And when we look into each of these cases, of course, some of them are due to multi-sig thefts and things of that nature, but a lot of them are due to kind of flaws in these trust assumptions that we have with bridges when we're trusting assets and we're locking assets in these bridges. And so related to bridges, what are the kind of metrics and trends we've been seeing? This is a great chart from my friend Elias, where we look at the kind of total value locked across all the different types of bridges that we have in the ecosystem. And we look at value locked as a metric because it basically implies the trust that users have given these bridges. When you lock value in a bridge, you're transacting in that bridge, and you're trusting that bridge with your funds to move funds across that bridge, right? And so this chart is a really good testament to how much trust users have in these bridges and how much utility they're deriving from them. And one of the biggest trends that we can see here is the pink layer, which is Polygon bridges, and then the purple blue kind of layer, which is now the Arbitrum bridges, are really the ones that have had staying power, especially in recent times as volumes and total value locked has declined pretty significantly. We've seen Polygon especially have pretty significant staying power in terms of usage, traffic, and value locked, in terms of the funds that remain locked in the bridge, which is something, it was a key takeaway. The other really interesting trend that we've been seeing is the kind of phenomenon of airdrop hunters, which is a pretty recent trend over the past few months, in fact. Specifically, with Arbitrum and with Optimism, you can see these little spikes here in the chart, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon. And the reason these spikes happened, when we really looked into it, was actually smart contract-based programs that generated addresses to programmatically interact with these bridges with the hopes of potentially getting an airdrop of some sort, right? For folks here who are on crypto Twitter, you know, there's plenty of threads now of how to get an airdrop for XYZ chain, right? I'm sure you've seen plenty of these. But what's been interesting is to actually see this play out on chain. There are actually hundreds of thousands of addresses. When you see these spikes here, you know, goes above 200,000 on a given day just to transact with a specific chain, with a specific bridge. And you see these incidents are very sparse in between. And one of the interesting things we did was actually look at some of the Twitter activity around that. Whenever one of these long threads were being published, this kind of activity did tend to tick up, which is a pretty interesting trend that we noticed. And while Arbitrum and Optimism have been largely programmatically driven, where there's a smart contract that generates addresses, a recent trend we've been seeing with newer chains has been genuine individual addresses, retail addresses potentially, that aren't really connected with each other, that are not programmatically generated, genuinely interacting with these bridges. You can see the uptick in traffic in depositors in the ZK Sync bridge, for example, just over the course of October and early November. It's been a pretty huge uptick, largely because of, you know, obviously anticipation around the potential launch of their token, but also same with Starknet. You can see this big uptick towards November. And when we see the address composition of these interactions, they're actually pretty disparate. They're not actually generated by a single smart contract, as is the case with Arbitrum. They're very disparate. They have their source of their funds is disparate, which is a very interesting trend, which basically signifies that there's genuine retail interest. Obviously, the numbers are quite lower here. It's like 5K to 2K, but pretty genuine interest in interacting with these ecosystems. And it's probably a trend that we'll start to monitor even more and more as newer and newer chains launch. How are their bridges being used? Because that's kind of the major way of how users can shuttle funds into these new blockchains. With each new blockchain that comes up, the primary way of getting funds into it is via a bridge, right? So while on-chain bridges are one big aspect, the other big trend, of course, is centralized exchanges being used as bridges. So as is often the case, you know, over the past year and a half, for example, Binance has been a huge route to get into and out of Binance Smart Chain. Rather than using an on-chain bridge, you can just get in and out of Binance and withdraw or deposit to the Binance Smart Chain, right? Which is a popular route we've been seeing. Likewise, as of a few days ago, FTX used to be the same with Solana, right? Which is a big pathway, very often traversed corridor. And while we can't actually see what goes on inside the centralized exchanges and follow the kind of funds all the way through like we can on-chain, one of the biggest things that we've been seeing is identical amounts being sent into a centralized exchange and also withdrawn onto these bridges. Of course, we have no way of knowing whether it's the same person or not, but the amounts kind of signify that similar amounts of value are generally being used to flow through these centralized exchanges and come out on the other side to these various blockchains, which is a pretty interesting trend. And especially, I want to highlight, over the past 2 days, we've been seeing quite a lot of this happen across many different centralized exchanges with the volatility that we've been seeing, which has been supremely interesting to see, especially as certain chains, for example, Solana experienced some downtime, some transaction congestion. Folks were trying to get funds out of different exchanges using different blockchains. So it was almost the inverse of this, where different blockchains were used to shuttle funds out of different exchanges. So for example, if say I as a user wanted to get funds out of a certain exchange, but I couldn't use Solana, I would actually use, for example, Binance Smart Chain or TRX, as is the case today, to get funds out, and then eventually transfer it back into a mainnet Ethereum or another blockchain of my choice. So the inverse was actually observed today in pretty significant volumes. Several $1 billion of volume happened in that inverse route today, which was extremely interesting to see as well. So yeah, so this is kind of the state of bridges today, some of the metrics that we're seeing. Obviously a lot of traction flows through these bridges now, and the key things we'll be looking out for is whether this inverse trend continues, And especially with centralized exchanges and being kind of a risky central point of failure, more and more traffic, whether that flows through bridges, on-chain bridges, and how their trust guarantees are actually enforced. Because if they're not, they're just another central point of failure, right? So that's kind of what we're looking forward to here. This is a visual from back in the day, from 2017, looking at internal transactions on Ethereum. But it's actually kind of similar today in terms of internal transactions amongst bridge contracts, where there's so many different tokens and different layers where you have to transact, especially when we're talking about roll-ups as well. When we're actually moving value across these ecosystems, how complicated is the transactional graph going to get, and how much of it will we actually be able to follow and understand? And so that's kind of the big trends that we're looking at, and a bit about bridges and bridge analytics. Thanks.
That was awesome. How's things? You well?
Yeah, great.
Hey man, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah.
Coming in on the late shift. I know what that was like. Hey, that was really interesting about the reversal that you saw with regards to flow, that inverse on the bridges.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, from a perspective of Coinbase, when we have market movements like this, I mean, how do you guys approach your day? Is there internal meetings? You have conversations? I mean, at your side of stuff, you know, how do you deal with a day like today and a day like yesterday?
Yeah, it's an exciting day. Obviously, a lot of movements happening. From my perspective, I can only speak from my perspective.
Yeah.
It's the on-chain side of things has been extremely active.
Yeah.
We've seen tremendous amounts of volume move on-chain,
yeah.
Especially on bridges, to and from exchanges and then to and from chains as people try to move liquidity. And in times of market volatility like this, some chains are actually a little more reliable than others in terms of actually performing and holding up under the stress.
Yeah, that's interesting to see that.
Yeah, so that's one thing we've been monitoring.
And did you see any ultimate flaws with any of the chains? I mean, you said Solana was down for a period of time. Okay.
Yeah, not necessarily down, it's just congested a little bit,
okay.
which was the same with happened with mainnet Ethereum, several of the roll-ups. It's just whether users could get their transactions through in times of crisis.
Listen, when we're talking about congestion, and for the OGs in the house, if you were ever into buying CryptoKitties, when Benny was doing CryptoKitties, I believe that brought down the Ethereum chain.
Yeah, right? it did.
Things have moved on since then a little, right?
Yep, definitely.
And so, certainly at Swissborg, we've seen a lot of inflows in the last kind of 48 hours. You've probably seen that on the Coinbase side of stuff. I mean, how do you think this is going to affect, and I've asked a lot of the speakers here today, how do you think it's going to actually affect the industry? How's it going to affect the space, you know, in the kind of medium term?
I think it really calls into attention the kind of importance of on-chain infrastructure and trustless infrastructure, really, because we're trusting these exchanges and opaque institutions that we don't have transparency over into with funds. And that's the beauty of on-chain dynamics of DeFi, right? With bridges, we can see exactly how the funds are stored. Of course, you have to do the work of auditing the code, but once you do that, it's transparent, which is the beauty of on-chain systems.
Well, you know, when you look at what happened with 3 Hours Capital and the liquidations, and also the Celsius debacle, actually, DeFi platforms like your Compounds, your Avis, your Makers, all performed exactly like they should have. There was no issues whatsoever. I haven't seen in the last 2 days because they pretty much locked me here for the last 2 days. Do you know? It's almost been like slavery here for me. Do you know that? It's like, hey, go into that stage, don't leave, don't know anything that's going on in crypto. It's kind of actually been quite liberating.
Yeah.
Because the only thing that I've known what's going on is from people like you.
For sure.
But really, and I hope this is the case this particular time, that DeFi platforms have done exactly what they should have done, and code is law, and hopefully they have gone to that law.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, to your point, even the infamous Alameda Research paid back their DeFi loan first. We could all see that on-chain yesterday before, you know.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I got to check it out. Sid, you're an absolute gentleman. You killed it. Thanks very much. Big round of applause for Sid.